I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Smells like victory.
Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe even good evening. Welcome to Unit 1, Lesson 20. Government is a man-made creation in order for protection. We're going to continue our conversation of rule of law versus rule of man this week, looking at John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Montesquieu, the Baron de, or the Baron of. We're going to look at their social contract theories. So by the end of this, what we want to be able to do is understand their social contract theories and how to apply them to this week's guiding questions. So real quickly, we want to take some quick outlining notes of 4 philosophers that fall into the same kind of camp. 3 of them are social contract theorists. So the first one is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was an English philosopher who's going to predate Locke. So we talked about Locke last week a little bit. Okay, Hobbes was born in 1588 and lived till 1679. His seminal work was called The Leviathan. And here you can take a look at some of his general beliefs on the state of nature and the nature of man. And as we can see, Hobbes did not believe that man was a very good person. But what he did believe is that there was one true government, that we gave our power over to what we call a sovereign, and that sovereign was the leader of our government, and that we had no right once we signed a contract to rebel against the sovereign, and then we give all control to them. So Hobbes really believed in a centralized authoritarian form of government. So on the other hand, we have John Locke. Born in 1632, died in 1704. So he was around during the same time as Hobbes. His seminal work was 2 Treatises of Government, which we looked at some pieces of earlier. Again, he believed in the state of nature and the idea of a social contract. He had some other ideas about rights that Hobbes did not, and those will be gone over a little bit later, but also check your notes from earlier about this. We stole a lot of John Locke's work to create the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson almost directly plagiarized him in our Declaration of Independence. As we can see, that he favored a more representative form of government, one in which the people had say, and that the limits of the government were to not just protect us, but to protect our property, our life, and our liberty. He also believed in a limited government, one that did not tamper in our lives outside of those benefits. So please take this moment, take down these key pieces of information about Locke. All right, from here we go on to the Baron de Montesquieu, or Charles Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755. You can see that he was a contemporary, but he was French, so he was a French noble. He wrote The Spirit of Laws in 1748. He was also somebody that believed in the state of nature, but he saw it a little bit differently than both Hobbes and Locke. He did not believe in a social contract, but he believed that the state of war is what led to governments, which is not much different than the belief of Hobbes and Locke. The state of nature was such a horrible place that it led us to the creation of governments. But directly, he did not believe in the idea of a government by social contract. But what he did believe in was the separation of powers, which is something that we borrowed from him. And we can also see those ideas that he kind of takes from the Roman Republic. The last philosopher we'll look at, and it is not covered in the video, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Rousseau was born in Switzerland in 1712, lived to 1778, so you can see that they're all fairly contemporary to the same time. He wrote his social contract theory in 1762. If we go through these, we can see a number of things that he believed. All right, he definitely believed that people hold the power, but his main slogan was, people were born free and everywhere they're in chains. The idea that we've been duped by landowners, and the idea of property is what has caused so much confusion and destruction in our world. So his main point is the idea of property, and those who have had it have convinced everybody else to allow them to lead. With this, we can see his major differences from the other philosophers. Alright, from here I'm going to take you on to the video for today. What you need to complete by the end of this video is a Venn diagram. So let's take a look at what we need to complete. Alright, so your exit ticket today will be a Venn diagram or a T-chart. You'll answer these 3 things. What are the similarities? between these philosophers? What are the differences? And finally, the third question or tier that we want to look at are, what are the concepts that we can apply to the guiding question for the week? So there's three general things that we want out of this, and you can do them in columns, you can do it in a Venn diagram, but you're looking at three different philosophers again. So what are the similarities between them? What are the differences? Okay, and that's the Venn diagram piece, or you can do it in a chart just like this, each column. Either way, that's going to be what you need to turn in before the end of class today or by the end of day. Okay, so you have this video to help with that, so you have some general notes to start. And again, here's your guiding question. Should the power of government lie in man or the law? So that's the guiding question for the last half of this week before we move on to the SOI. Enjoy the video.
In a world with no laws, no government, and no set social order, how do you believe people would behave? Would life be based on violence, fear, and chaos? Or would people see that their own survival and the success of society was dependent on their cooperation with others? Let's explore what philosophers Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau pondered on these very questions. Before the explosion of European philosophy during the Enlightenment, most rulers claimed their right to rule from what we call the divine right of kings. They claimed that their power came directly from God, and people being very religious, well, they didn't really question that. The Enlightenment, however, saw the development of what we call social contract philosophy. The idea of a social contract aims to explain the relationship between a people and government, where the belief is that the right to rule comes from the people. These different philosophies, however, saw that social contract in very different ways in terms of how much freedom people should give up to their governments and to the rulers in exchange for security and protection. The first philosopher we're going to look at here is Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes believed that human nature is inherently destructive and that at their core, if left to their own devices, we would have violence and chaos and society basically disintegrating. In his book Leviathan, he wrote, "In the state of nature, people are in that condition which is called war. In such condition, there is no place for industry, no culture of the earth, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." So in terms of the social contract, Hobbes very much believed that the most important thing to have is this strong authoritative figure that he called the Leviathan. We might call them monarchs or even dictators, but they wouldn't get their power from God. What Hobbes believed is that people would voluntarily give up their freedom, knowing that if they were left to be free, they would descend into chaos and violence, and that people should willingly give up their freedom to that authoritative figure. John Locke, however, believed almost the polar opposite of Hobbes. He believed that people were born with what he called a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, and there was no inherent anger or destructive tendencies in people, and so if left to their own devices, people would find a way to better themselves and just better society as a whole, being given as much freedom as possible. And so Locke believed the utmost importance in society was a limited government that served to promote people's life, liberty, and property. And about this, he wrote, "Men, all being naturally free, equal, and independent, so no one can be deprived of this freedom, and subjected to the political power of someone else without his own consent. The only way anyone can strip off his natural liberty and clothe himself in the bonds of civil society is for him to agree with other men to unite in a community, so as to live together comfortably, safely, and peaceably." Right? So Locke believed that, not only should people be free to enjoy their rights and freedoms, but they had the right to select their leaders and their governments. And Locke believed in what's called a representative democracy. This idea that we select leaders to make laws on our behalf, knowing that we're rational, making rational decisions to select good leaders, and those leaders are going to act rationally to make good laws that are going to protect those freedoms of ours. Furthermore, Locke believed that if we felt that these leaders aren't acting in our interests anymore, we should have the power to overthrow those leaders. And this could come in the form of a revolution, but more commonly we see this in the form of elections in our liberal democracies around the world. Rousseau, on the other hand, went in an entirely different direction altogether. He believed that all these freedoms and society that Locke's world would create would essentially lead to the kind of corruption and destruction that Hobbes talks about. And his saying is that man is born free, but everywhere in chains. So all these social structures that have been set up are what lead to corruption and jealousy and the disintegration of society. So then if you strip away all of these elements, what's left? People being free together in total equality, making decisions for what's best for the community, or what Rousseau called the general will. Without this situation where all of a sudden you might start getting power inequalities between people that lead to corruption, as Rousseau saw it. And so in this world of Rousseau's, decisions are made together by the community. Laws are made directly by the people of the community. And sometimes you might get your way, other times you might not. Sometimes maybe you don't get your way at all, but it's for what the majority of the community want. Or again, this idea of the general will of the community. And if that's what society deems best, well, that's what happens. So if we're to summarize these three philosophers with maybe their catchphrases, if you will, right? You have Thomas Hobbes and his belief that human nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So you need that strong authoritarian dictator in order to keep security in check. With Locke and his belief that freedom is of the utmost importance, government should be limited and only protect life, liberty, and property. And finally, Rousseau's big catchphrase that man is born free but everywhere in chains. People are good, but society corrupts. And so you strip away all of society, and what's left is that pure form of equality between individuals. And as you can see, most modern societies draw on the ideas of these three philosophers and their theories of what the social contract should look like. Generally, most liberal democracies are going to be most strongly related to John Locke's ideas of government protecting personal freedom and private property, although I'm sure you can also think of some examples where individual freedoms were restricted by laws in order to protect the security or the common good of the people of a society. Typically in situations where the people of a society maybe felt that individuals couldn't always be trusted to make the right decisions for that common good of the people. And these philosophers grappled with a question that is still one of the central challenges to our world today. To what extent should we allow the government and laws to limit our freedom in exchange for security? And with that question, I'll leave you for this time. Subscribe so you don't miss any videos in the future, and we will see you again next time.
All right, guys, thank you for your attention, and don't forget your exit ticket.
The Dalai Lama himself, the 12th son of the Lama, the flowing robes, the grace, bald, striking. So I'm on a first tee with him. I give him the driver. He hauls off and whacks one. Big hitter, the Lama. Long. Into a 10,000-foot crevice right at the base of this glacier. Do you know what the Lama says?
No.
Gunga, galunga. Gunga, gunga, gunga. So we finish 18, and he's going to stiff me. And I say, hey, Lama, hey, how about a little something, you know, for the effort, you know. And he says, oh, there won't be any money. But when you die, on your deathbed, you will receive total consciousness. So I got that going, which is nice.